17 years old, lying in a hospital bed almost 2,000 miles from home, about to go under for a 12-hour spinal surgery. And the one person fans expected to be standing next to her wasn't there. Not because he couldn't be, because he chose not to be. And by the end of this video, I'm going to show you the exact moment, the one detail buried in a single Instagram caption that tells you how Ysabel Brown really felt about that choice, years later, in her own words. But to understand why that moment hits as hard as it does, we have to go back to when this all started, back before the surgery, before the tears, before any of it made it to air. Ysabel Paige Brown was born on June 12, 2003, the fifth child of Kody and Christine Brown. Growing up in that big, complicated, blended family, Ysabel wasn't the loudest voice in the room. She was the quiet one, the one who'd rather keep her struggles to herself than make a scene about them. Which is exactly why what happened to her body when she was 14 years old is so hard to watch, even now. In 2017, when Ysabel was in middle school, her family discovered she had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that, when it's severe enough, can genuinely reshape a person's daily life. This part is documented, aired on the show itself. At first, the curve measured around 26 degrees. Doctors and the family agreed to try to manage it without surgery. Ysabel was fitted for a back brace, one she wore during the day and swapped for a heavier one at night. And she tried to hide it under her clothes so she wouldn't stand out at school. Imagine being 14 and having to strap yourself into medical equipment every single day, then walk into a classroom hoping nobody notices. For a while, the family also tried a specialized program built around exercises meant to help straighten the spine without surgery. And for a moment, it actually looked like it might be working. Her curve reportedly dropped from 45 degrees down to 35. But scoliosis, especially in a growing teenager, doesn't always cooperate. Over time, the curve crept back up, and it became clear that bracing and exercise weren't going to be enough. Surgery was no longer a maybe. It was the only option left. Think about what those years actually looked like day to day. Middle school is hard enough without a medical device strapped to your torso for most of your waking hours. Ysabel was reportedly self-conscious about the brace, doing what a lot of teenagers in her position do, layering looser clothes, sitting a certain way, hoping nobody asked questions in the hallway. And this went on for years, not weeks. Years of watching other kids move through adolescence without thinking twice about their own spine, while she had to plan her whole day around a piece of medical equipment. That's the part that gets lost when people just say, she had scoliosis, like it's a footnote. It wasn't a footnote. It was most of her middle school and early high school experience. And here's something worth sitting with for a second. This wasn't a hidden diagnosis. It played out on national television, season after season, while Ysabel was still a minor. Her worsening x-rays, her family's hesitation, her pain, all of it aired as content for a TLC audience before she was even old enough to fully consent to that level of exposure. Fans have gone back and forth on that for years, and it's a fair thing to sit with. Either way, by the time she reached her later teens, the decision had been made for her by her own body. The curve was too severe to manage any other way. Now here's where it gets complicated, and where the family dynamic that Sister Wives built its entire brand around comes crashing straight into a very real, very serious medical decision. Kody Brown, by his own admission on the show, was hesitant. He didn't want his daughter's quality of life complicated by a major operation. And for a long time, he pushed for anything else, braces, camps, alternative treatments, before he'd accept that Ysabel needed to go under the knife. Fans watching at home had a lot of feelings about that. But hold that thought, because Kody's reluctance about the surgery itself isn't even the part of this story that people are still talking about years later. That's coming. By August of 2020, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, Christine told Kody it was happening. Ysabel was getting her surgery in September, and it required traveling all the way to New Jersey for a specialist. And this is where the story shifts from will she need surgery to something a lot more personal. Kody, according to what aired and what's been widely reported since, asked whether the trip could be delayed because of the pandemic. He was worried about crossing state lines and breaking the strict quarantine bubble he'd set up with his fourth wife, Robin, and their children. At one point, by multiple accounts from that season, he even suggested Ysabel could make the trip without him, go get major spinal surgery, and he'd stay behind. We're told that suggestion broke her heart enough to bring her to tears. And I want to be careful here because this next part is where fans start to fill in gaps the show never fully explained. Nobody has ever put out an official, detailed breakdown of exactly what was said in that conversation. So some of the specifics are pieced together from what aired and what Christine has said since. But the core of it, that Kody chose not to make the trip, that part is not speculation. That part happened. On September 30th, 2020, Ysabel went into surgery. 12 hours. A procedure serious enough that most adults would want their whole support system in the room. Christine was there. Ysabel's mother did not leave her side. Kody did not make the trip. He stayed behind with Robin and their children, citing the pandemic bubble the family had built. Christine posted from the hospital that day, letting fans know Ysabel was in surgery and thanking everyone for their prayers and support. She was scared, she was hopeful, and she was doing it without her husband there. This whole stretch, the decision, the goodbye, the surgery, the fallout, eventually made it to air more than a year later in a season 16 episode that fans still bring up by name when they talk about this family's lowest points. The episode showed Christine breaking down over Kody's choice not to travel, and it showed just how much harder the recovery hit than anyone in that house had braced for. Pun very much intended. Viewers at home reacted almost instantly and almost unanimously. This wasn't a both sides have a point storyline for most of the fan base. People were angry on Ysabel's behalf. Some pointed out that Kody had, in other seasons, made long trips for far less urgent reasons. Others gave him the benefit of the doubt on the pandemic logistics, but still couldn't get past the image of a 17-year-old getting wheeled into major surgery without her dad in the building. Either way you land on it, the reaction from the audience was loud, and it hasn't really faded. Even now, years later, this is still one of the first things people bring up when Ysabel's name comes up in the comments of any Sister Wives video. So 30% into this story, and here's the moment I promised you at the start would matter later. Kody's absence from that hospital wasn't just a scheduling decision. Multiple entertainment outlets that cover the family closely have pointed to this exact stretch, Ysabel's surgery and Kody staying behind, as one of the breaking points that pushed Christine toward the decision she'd announced just over a year later, leaving the marriage entirely. Now, is that the single sole reason Christine left? Nobody has confirmed that in those exact terms. That's fans connecting a timeline that's honestly hard to ignore. But the timing lines up close enough that it's not hard to see why people keep bringing it up. Here's the thing, though. This isn't just a story about a marriage falling apart in the background. This is Ysabel's story. And what happened after that surgery is honestly the part that deserves way more attention than it usually gets. The recovery was brutal. By multiple accounts from people close to the family, it was far more intense than anyone expected going in. More pain, more limitations, more slow, grinding weeks of learning how to move again. This is a teenager who just had metal rods implanted along her spine, learning to walk differently, sit differently, sleep differently. And she did it mostly documented through her mother's updates and her own social media, not through some big dramatic TLC storyline arc, because real recovery isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It's exhausting. It's one small win at a time. Picture the actual mechanics of it for a second. After a spinal fusion like this, you're not just dealing with soreness. You're relearning how to bend, how to reach for something on a shelf, how to roll over in bed without your whole back protesting. Physical therapy becomes the new normal. Simple things, the things nobody thinks twice about, like putting on socks or getting out of a car, suddenly take real effort and real patience. For weeks, reportedly, Ysabel couldn't do the ordinary teenage things her friends were doing without a second thought. And she was doing all of it 2,000 miles from her dad, with her mom as her main support system, in a home that was itself about to be turned upside down by decisions being made elsewhere in the family. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Recovery on top of family stress. Most 17-year-olds recovering from major surgery get to focus on exactly one thing: healing. Ysabel was healing in the middle of a household that was quietly falling apart around her, even if the cameras hadn't caught up to that story yet. That combination, physical pain and family uncertainty at the same time, is a lot to carry at any age, let alone as a teenager. But hold that thought, because here's where the story turns and where Ysabel stops being someone things happen to and starts being the one driving her own comeback. Exactly 1 year later, in September of 2021, Ysabel posted an update to mark the anniversary of her surgery. And this part is documented in her own words, not a paraphrase from a tabloid. She told her followers the surgery was completely worth it, that she'd never felt more pain-free and more in control of her own body than she did a year later. Think about that phrasing for a second. In control of her own body. After years of hiding a brace under her clothes, after a surgery her own father hesitated to be present for, this 17, now 18-year-old young woman was standing on the other side of it, telling the world she felt free. She didn't stop there. She started sharing her surgical scar with fans, openly, without shame. And when people reached out asking whether they should get the same surgery for their own scoliosis, she told them, honestly, that she'd recommend it. That's not a small thing. That's someone taking the hardest chapter of her life and turning it into something that might actually help a stranger going through the same fear she went through. And physically, she bounced back in a way that genuinely surprised people watching along. Christine posted footage of Ysabel rock climbing, scaling an advanced indoor wall with what looked like zero hesitation, barely a year removed from spinal surgery. She went on a cross-country road trip with her mom and her younger sister Truly, over 2,000 miles, meeting people along the way, documenting it all with hashtags about hope and humanity. If you told someone in September of 2020, watching Ysabel wheeled into that operating room, that a year later she'd be climbing rock walls and road tripping across the country, they might not have believed you. 60% of the way through this story now, and here's where things start to shift from the surgery to the comeback. Because what Ysabel did next is honestly the part fans searching for Ysabel Brown now actually want to know about. She graduated high school in the spring of 2022, and instead of staying close to the family orbit in Arizona, she made a choice that quietly says a lot about who she'd become. She packed up and moved across the country to North Carolina to live with her older sister, Kody Brown, and Maddie's husband, Caleb. Not with her mom full-time, not in the family compound, with her sister, starting fresh, enrolling at East Carolina University University in Greenville. On Instagram, she captioned the move as the start of a new life in a beautiful place with a beautiful family. And if you think about everything she'd just been through, choosing independence, choosing to build something of her own away from the spotlight of the show, that's not a small decision. That's the entire second half of her comeback. And here's a detail worth sitting with. The sister she chose to move in with, Maddie, isn't even Christine's daughter. Maddie is Kody and Janelle's daughter. Ysabel didn't just move toward independence. She moved toward the family she felt safest with, wherever that fell in the complicated web of half-siblings this family is built from. Make of that what you will. Once she was actually settled in North Carolina, Ysabel started building a life that looked, honestly, pretty ordinary, which, after everything she'd been through, was probably exactly what she needed. Classes, campus life, a college town far removed from Las Vegas, Flagstaff, or any of the other places this family has called home over the years. She stayed active on social media, sharing pieces of her day-to-day, her studies, her niece and nephew through Maddie, the occasional callback to how far she'd come physically since 2020. Fans who followed her page watched a teenager who'd once hidden a back brace under her clothes turn into a young woman who posted rock climbing videos and cross-country road trips without a second thought about her spine. That's worth pausing on because it's easy to skip past. A brace she was embarrassed to let people see, a 12-hour surgery, a recovery that took the better part of a year to feel normal again. And on the other side of all of it, a college student, hundreds of miles from home, scaling climbing walls and posting about it like it's nothing. That gap between the girl hiding her brace at 14 and the young woman climbing walls at 19 is the entire comeback in one sentence. Now, I promised you I wouldn't leave Kody's role in all this hanging. And here's where fans have to hold two things at once, because it's more complicated than a clean villain story. Because even with everything that happened around the surgery, Ysabel hasn't cut her father out. In a November 2024 episode, during Christine's engagement to David Woolley, Ysabel had an emotional, on-camera moment with her mother, asking point blank whether David was going to try to replace her dad. Christine reassured her that no one could replace Kody, that David could be whatever kind of support figure Ysabel needed, but that her bond with her father was irreplaceable. And in her own confessional, Ysabel made it clear her worry wasn't about David taking over. It was rooted in a real, ongoing fear about how much of a relationship she still has left with Kody at all. That's the detail I promised you at the start of this video. Not a scandal, not a blow-up. Just a young woman, years after a surgery her father skipped, still holding space in her heart for him, still hoping the relationship isn't gone, even while building a life hundreds of miles away from him with her sister, her degree, and her own 2 feet under her. That's the real comeback. Not, she doesn't need him anymore. It's, she still wants him in her life, on her own terms, even after everything. And that's honestly what makes Ysabel's story different from some of the other fractures in this family that fans talk about. This isn't a clean story where a child cuts a parent off and never looks back. It's messier than that, and messier is more true to life. She's still processing what her relationship with Kody even is these days, still working through it in real time, in front of cameras, at an age where most people are figuring out their 20s without a national audience watching them do it. That takes a kind of courage that doesn't get nearly enough credit in how this family's storylines usually get framed. It's also worth remembering she's not alone in navigating that. Several of Kody and Christine's other kids have spoken, in their own ways, about the distance that opened up in different directions after the divorce. Some closer to their dad now, some further away, each relationship its own separate thing. Ysabel's path has been quieter than some of her siblings, less headline-driven, but no less real. She hasn't done a tell-all interview about her father. She hasn't used her platform platform to publicly air grievances. What she has done is live her life openly on her own terms and let people draw their own conclusions from the timeline. As for where she is now, by most recent updates from people who follow the family closely, Ysabel has continued down that same path of independence, working toward finishing her degree and, by the most recent fan-tracked updates going into this year, appearing to have completed her college journey. TLC hasn't put out some big glossy graduation special, which honestly tracks. A lot of Ysabel's biggest wins have happened quietly, off camera, on her own terms, the same way she's handled almost everything since that hospital bed in New Jersey. So here's the question I want you to sit with, and I genuinely want to know where you land in the comments. Was Kody's absence at Ysabel's surgery the real breaking point for this family? The moment that, more than any headline-grabbing fight, actually cracked something that never got fully repaired? Or do you think the marriage was already so far gone by 2020 that this was just one more chapter in a much longer story? Drop your take below. I read every single one of these, and this fan base always has the most interesting takes on where the real fault lines in this family actually are. If you want more of these deep, respectful dives into what's actually confirmed versus what fans have pieced together across this family's story, hit subscribe because there's a lot more of this coming. Ysabel went through one of the hardest physical and emotional stretches this family has ever aired, and she came out the other side building a life on her own terms. That's a comeback worth talking about.